Chris.
Can you hear me? Oh, perfect. Yeah, so feed everybody and turn the lights out. Great day is just what you want to do before a technical presentation. So if you snore, luckily the chairs aren't perfectly sleepable, but I think we'll be all right. My name is David Heikkinen, and I really just want to thank Debbie and the Chamber for putting this together. The food was great, perfect for the day, and really do appreciate them doing this, and it's really an honor to be here. So I work with White Hawk Energy, been working in the community for about the last year, really focused on, we're a minerals and royalty buyer. And so we've been focused on the carbon storage royalties and trying to understand projects in the area. And really candidly, y'all are in a great position as a community and as landowners of, this is a hub for what's going to happen for carbon storage. And as you all know, there's plenty of development in the area where there's carbon emissions as well. And so, you got great geology, you got great emissions, and what we thought is, as opposed to hearing from us, bring in an independent, expert really. Tip Meckel is with the Texas Bureau of Economic Geology and has written, treatises on this area and was really instrumental in the original offshore leases with the Texas General Land Office. Is in this unique position of helping us understand what happens whenever a carbon storage project comes to a community, both for beforehand, during the development, and then afterwards. And what we think is as we go forward, those unknowns and uncertainties are going to get resolved, and he'll help understand what's the size of the warehouse underground, how do emissions flow in, how do wells get drilled, what does that mean from a traffic standpoint and pipelines and right-of-way, how does this happen over the long term? And talking to Tip beforehand, I've been lucky to get to know him over the last year or so. He really is the expert. And without further ado, I'll just hand it over to Tip. The way we've got it organized, we've got an agenda on the table. There's kind of 4 parts. Tip will just talk through and we'll ask questions. Please, if you have any questions, we'll just do that in kind of 15-minute increments as we go. But thank you, Tip, for coming in.
Great. Well, wonderful to be here. Thanks for having me. I guess a little bit of personal background, 6th generation Texan, grew up in Houston, been through geology for basically my entire life, came from an oil and gas family. We have 4 of the 6 members of the family are in geoscience, so something that was natural for me to get involved with early on, but as I started seeing the opportunities early in my career, postgraduate career, the carbon piece was really interesting to me. So I put all my efforts into carbon. So I've been working as a research scientist at UT in Austin in what's called our Gulf Coast Carbon Center for the last 18 years or more, 100% on CCS. So got into it when I honestly didn't even know if it was going to be a thing. I was a little worried that I could raise a family being a researcher on CCS, but that was pretty quickly evident, and so I've stuck with it. So I started coming over to Southeast Texas, I guess 8 or 10 years ago, through many of you may know Jeff Hayes. He was actually came to the bureau, and he was curious about carbon, and we started talking, and he said, well, why don't you come over? And so I started coming over to Port Arthur mostly early on, and saw what was here and what the opportunities were, and so realized that this was going to be a place that was going to be really a development hub for this early on. So continued to do that, and so all this experience I'll bring to you is coming to you as a scientist from the Carbon Center, and I'll try and cover most of what's on that sheet. I will pause kind of at natural breaking points, see if you have questions or comments, and we'll just kind of go as we go. If there's a lot of questions, we'll try and get to them, because I think that's more important than necessarily hearing about everything I have to say. I could probably spend a week with you and not get through everything I could convey to you. So the first thing I did when I started at the Bureau was actually to sit on a well in Liberty County. And that was one of the very first CO2 injection wells for storage that the Department of Energy funded. So if you're familiar with Spindletop, that was the Spindletop of CCS in the region as well. And that was working in the Frio Formation. And so I sat that well and was heavily involved in that project early on. And from that just kept moving into bigger projects. But really have experience in everything. My background's in geology and geophysics, so mostly subsurface, but that's kind of brought me into the surface issues as well, pipeline, capture, etc. So I'll try and convey a lot of that, but realizing you're mostly coming from a landowner base, a lot of what I have to say is really related to what this looks like for landowners and what concerns or questions that you might have that I can help you think through. I won't necessarily have everything you need to know, but I have a lot of resources and you'll be able to follow. So I'll get started here, and first thing to mention is the center is the largest CO2 research center in the United States. So we have a large group of people there. You can see their images up there, but we have people working everything from sort of the shallow groundwater aspects to deep subsurface. Most all of us are in the subsurface. We do have some people that are working on community outreach and things like that, but we're mostly a subsurface geotechnical unit. So that's really where most of my experience and background comes from. But we've been around at least 22 years since the center's existed. So been working on this for a long time. And I think a lot of people are surprised to realize how much has actually gone into this. I know for communities it can often feel like, well, this just landed on your doorstep and it's brand new. And I get that. But I'll try and convey a lot of the things that we have done in the past and what we do know. The other thing I need to be transparent about is the center is sponsored by a dozen or more companies over that time period, and we meet with them twice a year, talk about things that are related to their interests and project development. But I'm not going to speak for any of these entities that you see up here, and I won't speak about anything specific to issues you may have encountered with them. But I feel like you need to know that, yes, I do talk to the industry side as well. In fact, we're quite involved with many of the projects in Southeast Texas from the research side. So we do come to this sort of as in the middle, I would say. So we're federally funded mostly, so this is about maybe 10 or 15% of our financial support. The other 80 or 90% comes from the U.S. Department of Energy. So we're sitting in a research space that's federally funded mostly, but do interact with the operators. So I thought just very briefly, why are we doing this? Like, how did this come to happen, right? So I'm not going to really come at this from a climate standpoint, but just from an energy development standpoint. So this triangle just represents carbon at the top, oxygen at the left, and hydrogen at the bottom right. And essentially, when people talk about the energy transition, really what we're talking about is just moving down the right side of that diagram. So we would have started with fuels that are, say, wood, essentially, and moved to coal, and then moved to oil. And as you come down that line, you're essentially reducing the amount of carbon that's involved in the fuel. And so the end point is hydrogen. So you may hear, like, there's a lot of big hydrogen developments in the region. Wow. Well, ultimately, hydrogen is a zero carbon related fuel or energy carrier, as a lot of people say. And you can co-burn hydrogen in some turbines for electricity generation today. You can also use hydrogen for refining, and you can convert it into ammonia, which is one of the most traded commodities on the planet. That's fertilizer. And you can convert it into methanol, which is used in a lot of chemical processes. So hydrogen is a natural attractor because it's a low carbon, high density energy component that also allows for a lot of industry technical development. So the other thing that you've probably seen happening in this part of the Gulf Coast is a lot of LNG export. So Texas and a lot of the United States went from considering natural gas import through LNG or liquefied natural gas to essentially turning around and becoming the world's largest natural gas exporter. And the vast, vast majority of that is coming between New Orleans and Corpus Christi. So the excess of natural gas production that really developed through the fracking revolution throughout the United States has led to an excess of gas, and so we're driving down there because you can take methane, CH4, and you can crack it and turn it into hydrogen, H2, but you produce a lot of CO2. So as you get into the LNG methane space and the hydrogen space, it's also become very much now a carbon management space. So the entities involved in this are really focused on lowering the carbon intensity of all of these activities. So I just wanted to tell you that's why we're going here. It's not some, we're not wandering off into some weird space that doesn't make sense. This is actually a very natural progression to end up here. And that's why here, and that's why we're managing carbon. All of these are very carbon intensive activities. Okay, so what is carbon management? It's hard for you to see back there, I'm sure, but I'll just walk you left to right. You can look at the upper left, which would be like your power sources, maybe some of your big industry activities, refineries, etc. And that's a sort of a point source of CO2. And then you can look in the lower left, and that's sort of what we think of as other sources of CO2. That could actually be the atmosphere. We could be taking CO2 directly out of the atmosphere. And there are projects that are doing that now too. And then in the middle, you just see the transport piece. And the transport is mostly by pipeline. We have thousands of miles of CO2 pipeline in the United States. A great deal of that is in Texas, mostly in the Permian Basin, but also a very large pipeline network that goes from Jackson, Mississippi, right through Southeast Texas over to South Houston. So pipelines already exist and are built today to move CO2. You'll see other things in there like ships. Actually, shipping CO2 is actually now a thing. There are 2 ships on the planet that are built to transport CO2, and that is entirely for offshore storage. So we'll see diversification in the way we transport CO2, but it's mostly pipeline. Food grade CO2 that you can find in your beverages, that's all moving by truck. You probably see those trucks occasionally on the roads, but it's a tiny proportion of what's out there. And then on the right is what you do with it. You can go to the upper right, and that's sort of conversion. You can convert it into materials or other things. That's great. That's products that are valuable that you can sell. There's an economic reason to do that. It just doesn't actually absorb or take in a lot of the CO2 that we need to manage. It's actually a tiny component. We cannot carbonate our drinks enough to get out of this problem, and that's not a permanent solution anyway. So what's in the lower right is what you're interested in, which is, okay, we can go put this in the subsurface, and we can put it into different places in the subsurface. They could be depleted oil and gas fields, they could be what we call saline aquifers, and I'll have a bit more on this. But essentially, the vast, vast majority of the CO2 that is intended to be managed is going to go into the subsurface. And we call it storage, but we don't really want it back. A lot of people think of it, it's really more of like a disposal activity. It's being put away for permanent benefit to the atmosphere. So this just represents a few things about where we can put it in the subsurface. The most important thing to write down is this is deep. This is not in the shallow intervals like in the upper hundreds or even thousands of feet. This is down between, say, 5,000 and 10,000 feet. So a mile or 2 beneath the surface. So if you go a mile or 2 from here, that's how far in the subsurface we're doing that activity. This is where a lot of oil and gas comes from. So we know a lot about it. You can put it into a depleted oil and gas field, that is one that's no longer productive. There you have a demonstrated retention of buoyant fluids in the subsurface, like oil or gas. And so that is an obvious place to think about. It does usually have a lot of what I'll call legacy wells. Those are wells that were used to develop the oil and gas, and those are all considered in the permitting of CO2 injection wells. So those depleted fields have their own set of criteria. You can inject CO2 for enhanced oil recovery. This is the vast majority of our experience with CO2 injection in the subsurface. Is actually in enhanced oil production. This is mostly done out in the Permian Basin. We've been doing it for over 50 years. So injecting CO2 into the subsurface for enhanced oil production is actually quite a well-known activity. We don't research it at all. It's a really well-defined business. It was under development in the Gulf Coast. That pipeline that goes from Jackson to Houston was originally built for enhanced oil recovery. But because of issues related to sort of the pandemic, decreased oil price and uncertainty in oil price going forward, it was realized that the capital intensity of those projects wasn't really worth developing. And so that entity, which was Denbury Resources, essentially started converting over to a carbon storage business related to CO2 in those pipelines, and we started taking in industrial CO2. So we have CO2 being captured in Port Arthur from a steam methane reforming unit to make hydrogen. They capture the CO2 and then put it in the pipeline and use it. We're using it for advanced oil recovery, now we're considering it for storage. So that is the pipeline network that was actually bought by ExxonMobil back, I guess, last year, maybe it was 23. And so that has led to the backbone of CO2 transport in the Gulf Coast that already exists. I have a map of that. The vast majority of the carbon storage is actually going into what we call saline formations. Saline meaning salty water. So all the water in the subsurface beneath the potable drinking water is extremely briny, very salty, much saltier than seawater. So the cutoff is 10,000 TDS, or total dissolved solids. So anything less than 10,000 TDS is considered agricultural or municipal drinkable water. Anything greater than 10,000 TDS is considered brine, not non-usable water. So mostly we're pushing CO2 into the rock. The rock is displacing that brine, and the CO2 is getting trapped in the rock like oil and gas get trapped. And you may be thinking that's pretty difficult. Well, it's not that difficult. And if you think about your sponge or your sink, if you put it under the faucet and fill it with water, water will go into the sponge. And that's CO2 going into the pore space. If you hold the sponge up, a very small amount will drip out. But by far, the vast majority of it is in the sponge. It's trapped in the pore space. That's what happens in the subsurface. You squeeze the sponge, it'll go out, but it'll stay in there if it's in the right place. So all of this is meant to find the right place, and luckily in the Gulf Coast we have a vast resource in the subsurface that is really favorable for storage. In fact, I'll show you a map. It's considered to be the best resource in the United States for storage. Okay, so that's where you can go with it. On the capture side, this probably doesn't, maybe is of less interest to you, but the top row there is what we call sort of the low partial pressure, low concentration CO2. It's coming out of point sources like power generation or fast power plants or even direct air capture out of the atmosphere. So very expensive because the CO2 is at low pressures and it's at low concentration. So you have to spend a lot of money to concentrate it and pressurize it. In the lower list, and that's with natural gas processing, ammonia, ethanol, and cement, those are higher concentration CO2 sources, and they're usually coming off at higher pressures. So it's cheaper to go after those sources of CO2. You'll find entities in this region that are addressing all of these. Different costs. To you, a CO2 molecule is a CO2 molecule once it's in the pipeline and in the subsurface. It doesn't matter where it comes from. The purity standards for moving CO2 in a pipeline and sticking it in the ground are essentially pure CO2. So it doesn't really matter if it's cleaned up to the same purity. But that's just to let you know a little bit about the capture side. Direct air capture is a thing. It's pretty novel still, but you'll find a big project in West Texas that is building enormous fan systems like this to move air over absorbents to pull CO2 out of the atmosphere and concentrate it and inject it. So we may see more and more of these kinds of projects. These can be powered by typical power off the grid, which might be coming from natural gas or other sources, or they could be powered by solar or wind, in which case the electricity is propane, and so that CO2 is actually in the market for value because it doesn't involve the combustion of a hydrocarbon emission to actually propane. Anyway, this is a concept many people struggle with trying to figure out like why you would do that. But this is actually becoming a more financial activity in some cases for capture than the immense amount of expense that goes into the capture side. As a landowner, you need to realize the cost structure of these projects is dominantly in capture, then in transport, and the amount of money that's spent on the development side is the minority of the money that's related to it. So even though the project sounds really big, all of that money is mostly being spent on the subsurface piece is actually really big. So when you hear big numbers of project development, $500 million development, $1 billion development, that doesn't mean they have lots and lots of money to put into the storage piece because they got to go after the capture piece and transport piece, which is really expensive. So it's easy to get romanced by the big numbers, but in terms of when it comes down to the landowner agreements, it's actually not, unfortunately, the most post-capital development. We've already done a lot of CCS, and this may or may not be news to you, but I mentioned that the center's been around for 22 years. I've been doing it 18 or more. The Department of Energy has literally poured billions and billions of dollars into this technology over time. And they have developed projects all over the United States and supported projects internationally. So I've worked on a project in Japan, I've worked on a project in the North Sea, I've worked on a lot of projects in the US. These are a lot of expense. So that steam methane reforming unit at the Valero facility that Air Products operates and gets CO2 out of, that was an enormous DOE funding activity. I think DOE put $500 million into that project to help get that capture going, because it's very expensive to do, and there's no financial incentive, to do that originally. I'll get to the point of how we finance these projects through tax credits mostly a little bit later, and we can have some Q&A on that. But you'll see, it's probably hard to see on there, there's two red dots that are in the Gulf Coast. One is the Air Products facility in Port Arthur, and one is the Petronova coal-fired power plant southwest of Houston. And those were both two DOE-funded capture projects that worked on the capture side. So a lot of money's been spent, a lot has been done. I couldn't possibly convey to you all of the subsurface experience that's been gained doing this, but suffice it to say that there's a lot that is there to learn about if you want, and a lot of experience. I mentioned that different parts of the country have different subsurface resources for this. Again, you probably can't see a lot of that detail, but the only thing that really matters to you is that down there in the Gulf Coast, you see that one. So, oh yeah, that's much better. Okay, so down there in the Gulf Coast, you'll see a big number, 1,800 gigatons. That's like a tremendous amount of potential storage. So the state of Texas is the largest emitter by far, more than the next two states combined. That's because we're a heavily industrialized state. We produce a lot of products that we export. So we are a very CO2 intensive state. But most of the best storage is actually sitting right underneath us, which is awesome, because if most of our storage was in North Dakota, we have kind of a big transport issue to solve. Here, you can literally go straight down and you're going to find good storage, guaranteed. That's kind of amazing to think about. In that 5 to 10,000 foot range of mileage stratigraphy is an enormous amount of sand and shales to retain it. So by far, so that's again why things are happening here. It's a concentration of emissions, and it's a concentration of incredible storage resources. Okay, first resource for you to write down is ccusmap.com. This is a great resource where you can go and see where projects are being developed. You can click on these things and learn about the projects. There's a public-facing part of this, and then there's a subscription-based part of this. If you pony up for the subscription, you basically just get access to some of the public documents that are related to the projects, i.e., permit applications, etc. So you can see a lot of dots in the upper Midwest. That's all ethanol, corn ethanol. So you've got ethanol, 10% ethanol in your gasoline. That's all your ethanol, and it produces a lot of CO2 that's really cheap to get. So that's why all those yellow dots are up in the upper Midwest. Then you'll see the blue lines are CO2 pipelines. A lot of them concentrate down there in West Texas, where all that CO2 EOR has been going on. And then you'll see a vast majority of dots along the Gulf Coast. And that's because of the concentration of emissions between, say, the Mississippi River corridor and Corpus, and the excellent geology in that region. So that's why, again, why here? Why are we doing this here? And I'll zoom in a little bit and keep zooming in. So there's kind of your understanding of blue dots are enhanced oil recovery, yellow and orange dots are saline storage. So two totally different provinces, two different geologies, two different really processes. So you get a what's called class 2 well to inject CO2 for enhanced oil recovery. You can apply to the Railroad Commission to get a class 2 well, and that would probably be approved in a relatively short period of time, a matter of months. To get a class 6 CO2 injection well, I'll go through some of that process a little bit later, but it can be a year to 2 years to get that class 6 injection well permit. So all those yellow dots and orange dots are thinking about saline formations, and they're all thinking about class 6 wells. Okay, so two totally different things. So all of the details are not transferable necessarily. If you keep zooming in, you'll start to see more granularity in this, and you'll see that there's a huge cluster in the Golden Triangle. And that's because, aside from the Mississippi River corridor and the Houston Ship Channel, it's the largest concentration of industrial emissions in the United States, aside from the Ohio River Valley and all the coal-fired utilities that are up there. So again, that's where why those dots cluster there. You will see some polygons in the offshore. That's the state offshore leasing. I've been heavily involved in that. I did end up recommending the offshore Jefferson County area as the first place to start in Texas, and that happened with the Bayou Bend lease. And we've seen now, I think there are 7 offshore leases, each about 100 square miles. But there's also a tremendous amount of onshore activity. The geology doesn't change at the coastline in the subsurface. It's continuous. So being onshore or offshore from a geological standpoint doesn't make a big difference. What does make a big difference is onshore, you're mostly dealing with a lot of landowners. In the offshore, you're dealing with one landowner, which is the state of Texas. So there has been, and you can get larger leases generally. So that's kind of another thing to keep in mind is there's the offshore and then there's the offshore. Fairly different ways of how a project might be developed. And then I think I zoomed in one last time just to kind of give you a sense of what's going on in your immediate area. And again, you can click on these dots and you can see what companies operating the project, what they've initially got planned, etc. There's might be some news links in there. The blue line is the existing CO2 pipeline network, so we know it's there. By far the largest onshore holding is that sort of pinkish area in western Jefferson County. That's 100,000 acres. It's part of the Bayou Bend project that also has the offshore lease in far east Texas. Again, this is a resource for you to go to. You can learn about these things, and there's different ways to get information on them. I think I just changed this to show some of the electric utility sources. So those higher cost electric utility sources are shown there now, and you can see a ton over in the Houston area and some over here. But there's a whole diversity of sources of CO2 to work with here. Okay, so that will be there. Oh, by the way, all of this I'll transfer to the chamber. They can distribute it to their listserv afterwards. The Bayou Bend project, you see there on the left, that's a Chevron Equinor Total Energies project. It's about 63 square miles offshore, Jefferson County in the far eastern side, just up against Louisiana reporter. They did drill a stratigraphic test well out there already, so that jackup rig is actually the rig that was used to drill that stratigraphic test well. And I'll come back to the stratigraphic test well versus the class 6 injection well a little bit later. And then you can see ExxonMobil's got some offshore leases, BP has an offshore lease. So that's kind of the offshore side of it. But you're here for the onshore, so I'm not really going to focus a lot on that, more on that. And so really we can talk about the subsurface in a lot of different ways. Many people's understanding of the subsurface is either derived from oil and gas experience through leasing or development. And by and large it's similar, except there are some very unique aspects of CCS that are different. One is obvious, you're injecting rather than extracting. But two, you're elevating pressure in the subsurface as a part of the project. That's actually a big part of the permitting. It's actually more related to pressure than to CO2 actually. And so you can imagine lots of different subsurface settings. The main physics of storing CO2, aside from the sponge analogy, is that it's buoyant in the subsurface. Even in those pore spaces, it's less dense than the residue brine. So it does want to move vertically, if it can, just like oil and gas. But oil and gas also moved to places where they were trapped, basically permanently. And so those same geologies are what retain CO2. So the physics of retaining CO2 in the subsurface is the exact same as retaining methane in the subsurface. And so you can imagine going into lots of different areas. The key risk that most of the permitting addresses and most landowners are interested in is potential impacts to near surface drinking water, or what we call USDW, underground sources of drinking water. That USDW is a term that's used in the permitting. And so protection of USDW is through the Safe Water Drinking Act. It's a federal thing. And the other thing is because of the pressure elevation, you could imagine that there could be some potential microseismicity. And by microseismicity, I'm talking about things that aren't even really felt at the surface. These are, if you know anything about earthquake magnitudes, these are negative scale events. These are events that are, again, you wouldn't even feel them at the surface. One thing I need to tell you is that we don't expect a lot of that in the Gulf Coast. And why can I say that? It's because we already have dozens and maybe even 100 or more injection wells operating in coastal parishes and counties that inject at rates that are very similar to CCS. And you probably never heard anything about microseismicity because these rocks are kind of not even real rocks. They're really young in geology sense, and they're much more pliant, right? So the sand grains tend to move a little bit. They're not fully cemented in many cases. Like I could pull a core out of a well, I could core the material and pull it to the surface from 5,000 feet, and it would pour like sand out of the core bed. Now that may or may not be what you find on your property, but the point is that these are not the same rocks that are in West Texas and Oklahoma. So we did not expect, and we have operational experience to back that statement up. We don't expect it. Does that mean we're not going to monitor for it? No. Many of the projects, especially the ones that we developed here, include a component of surface seismometers to measure for those events. I suspect they're going to hear a lot of nothing, but they'll be there to listen all the same. So those are the two primary risks: the potential impact on groundwater and the potential seismicity risk. In the subsurface, there are three main ways we get information. We can basically drill a hole and take a core of the rock, like I described. That's the picture in the lower right. We do this routinely. You pull up the core, you can core the reservoir with the CO2 is going to go, you can core the combining system. That's usually required for the permitting. And you can actually physically look at the material. So that's really important that you actually put your hands and test it, etc. The other way we do it is on the left. Those are electric well logs. So once the hole is drilled, we can lower a tool in there using electrical currents and other techniques. You can actually interrogate the rock through the wellbore you can learn a lot about them. So the vast majority of what we understand about subsurface is really coming from these logs. And you can usually correlate the logs directly to the core, right? So you have a physical material that's actually reinforcing what your surface is telling. So logs is another way, and then the last one in the sort of background on the right is seismic data. So you may actually find, and I've seen recently new surveys being planned, where we're going to acquire new seismic data. What does this involve? It involves basically moving either a truck or some sound source, some physical sound source to a location and sending a sound signal into the subsurface, and it reflects back. And it's collected by receivers, and those receivers are turned into a picture of the subsurface. So think of it like a sonic graph. You send energy in, it reflects back, you make a picture, and you get to see what's there. That might not look like it does to me. So those are the ways to get information. If a company is wanting to do a seismic survey on your property, they do have to do it, of course, and they may need a lot of access to your property, a lot of lines usually, and sometimes it's spacing. And so that could mean we have like what's called a fiber-sized truck that comes onto your property. It's a truck that can put a lot of and essentially puts a pad down on the ground, and it shakes at a very high frequency. And that's the sound source. We used to do this by drilling holes and detonating dynamite. We don't really do that anymore for a lot of reasons. So fiber size is typically what's used. It's not to say that somebody might not propose other types of methods on your property, but that would be probably the one way you would collect the seismic data. There's 2D data, that's like a section, like a slice through a cake, where you see just in 2 dimensions, and there's 3D data, which is a full 3D image of the subsurface. So those are all things you may come to hear about. The other thing about the subsurface is that pressure in the fluid, in the pore space, the pressure of that fluid increases as you go down. If you've ever gone from the top of a swimming pool down to the bottom of the swimming pool, your ears probably start to get a little bit of pressure. You can feel that increase in pressure. That's the weight of the water pushing down, pushing into your ears, causing higher fluid pressure at the bottom of the pool than the top of the pool. That's just exactly the same thing in the subsurface. In the shallow interval, we have what we call very normal pressure fluids. That is, they're just responding mostly to the weight of that water in the pore space. And so they'll follow those black dots, which is what we call the normally pressured section. At depths usually about 10 or 15,000 feet, the fluid pressure tends to go up. There's a lot of reasons for that, but I don't think I need to get into it because we're not thinking about developing that overpressured section. What we're interested in is those blue arrows, which is how can you raise the pressure from the existing ambient conditions up to the maximum allowable subsurface pressure. So every injection well that gets permitted for wastewater disposal, acid gas injection, hazardous waste disposal, CO2 injection, all of those wells will have a maximum allowable surface injection pressure. And that's to keep the subsurface rocks from experiencing so much pressure that they will break. So that's mandated. In fact, it's usually 80% of that amount. So there's a buffer. And so if you know anything about fracking rocks, then you know that you basically pressure it up enough to basically pulp it up. So we're really pretty good about knowing what pressure we can operate in the subsurface without overstraining the rocks. But those blue bars represent the amount of space that you can basically add pressure through injection for the project. So that pressure is moving through the subsurface, not necessarily physically, right? It's moving by compression of the core wall. And if you go back like that, and back to the CO2 project, the pressure will go out much further than the actual footprint of the CO2. And it's for that reason that we need a lot of space to work with the CO2 projects. There will be a footprint of CO2, and then there'll be a footprint of elevated pressure. And the elevated pressure region that's of interest in the permitting process is called the area of review. That's another good thing to write down, because if you're a landowner, you're going to want to have lots of questions about the area of review. in the permitting process, what is happening in the area of review in the subsurface, what legacy wells might exist inside the area of review. That's the permitted area, actually, for a project. And it's very potentially, almost certainly, smaller than the area of elevated pressure. But you'll find that large lease areas are needed because the pressure will propagate out. Okay, so subsurface data, a little bit on pressure. How big is the warehouse? So think about it like this room. How much could you fit in this room if you needed to? We do those calculations in the subsurface, and I'm not going to bore you with the calculation except to say that it's the same calculation we would use to estimate the amount of original oil or gas in place in a reservoir. So we would basically look at how much porosity is in the rock. We would look at how much saturation we're expecting in that porosity for the CO2. We basically do a fixed calculation. That's called a static capacity estimate. It doesn't include any dynamics of fluid flow or well performance or elevated pressure. It's just a physical measure of the warehouse and how much CO2 is in the warehouse. So those are the initial capacity assessments that a lot of entities would do just at the very beginning to know that something is feasible. Like the warehouse is basically big enough. And then they go into a whole lot of extra work to refine that. So static capacity ends up becoming a very long and detailed process where you build a subsurface model of the reservoir and the sealing intervals, and you basically then simulate injection of CO2, and you look at what happens in the model, and you use that model in your permitting and in your monitoring to ensure that conformance is occurring. The things that are happening down there are the things that the model predicts. We use these same models in oil production to predict how much oil we're going to produce in a given quarter for quarterly production reports or something. So this is a very well-known workflow for how you might do that. And then you go to a case where you might look at the CO2 saturation within that model to look at the distribution of CO2 and pressure in the model. So all of this is required in the permitting. And it does include dynamics, so it's not static, it's including the actual well injection rates, much more complex geology representation rather than maybe a simplified version in the static calculation. And this is what you would actually base your project economics on in the end. So modeling and simulation is where we get a lot of the answers for how big. A typical well injection rate, globally, if you do the average CO2 injection well rate, it's about 800,000 tons a year, which may make 0 cents, what is that? It's equivalent to what we do in sort of wastewater disposal in terms of barrels per day. If you're mathematically inclined and want to do it, it's about 20 MCF per ton. So 20,000 cubic feet per ton, and you could convert it over if you wanted to, but if you're talking about it, 500,000 to 1 million tons of CO2 per year, times say 10 to 20 years, a single well might be putting on order of 10 or 15 million tons of CO2 into the ground per year. That would almost be like the equivalent of probably like 100,000 cars per year of emissions, just to give you a sense of how much that is. I had a short video, and because of your distance, you might not be able to appreciate, but I thought you might want to see what this stuff does moving through the subsurface. So here we've just used a red dye to help us understand how the CO2 would move through sandstone material in the subsurface. A tremendous amount of work has been done on this in the lab to understand this kind of flow behavior. And you can see it prefers to move in higher porosity or higher permeability layers. And this is just a sand tank that's maybe a couple meters long and a half a meter high. So it's just meant as a visualization of how CO2 moves through the rock as it displaces that rock. Okay. On the risk side, and then we'll just pause for some questions on this piece of the presentation. There's a lot of existing wellbores out there. In Texas, there's 1 million wellbores already drilled. That's because we produced a tremendous amount of oil and gas in the past. So, so there's a lot of legacy wells out there, and all of them need to be, well, not all of them, but the ones that are in the project area are assessed in the permitting process. So legacy wells is probably, actually from a landowner point of view, aside from the groundwater, probably one of the most critical things to think about. And I'm going to give you some ways to think about that. The well is constructed in sort of a telescoping way. So, and this is not to scale obviously, but that upper largest diameter casing is typically like a surface casing or a conductor. It might go down hundreds of feet, tens to hundreds of feet. Typically for any injection well permit, the surface casing has to go through all of the protected groundwater. So that largest diameter casing is going down through the groundwater. And then we're telescoping the wells. We go down deeper and deeper and drilling down to smaller diameters. But in each of those casings, we're setting usually cement. And so if you cut that casing in half and look at it, those are the cements that are in those casings, right? And so a lot of the CO2 injection wells, in fact, I think it's required that you cement all of those strings all the way to surface. No gaps. Like in this well, you see there's actually some gaps where there's no cement in the string between two of those telescoping wells. In the CO2 wells, that would be completely full of cement. So each stage of the well is cemented and it's nested in a wider diameter as you go near the surface. So when you're at the surface, you're actually looking at, near surface, you're looking at potentially, 5 steel and cement barriers between the injecting CO2 and the rock. You perforate the very bottom of the well, you poke holes in it, and that's where the CO2 goes out at the bottom of the well. Okay, so that's kind of well construction. I've encountered some of this old casing from like 1940s wells in the field on different projects. In a lot of cases, it can look really quite good. And so this is just a case where we looked at some, 75-year-old casing and almost has no pitting. This happens to be from southwestern Mississippi, but it's kind of what I would expect for a lot of the older casings in the Gulf Coast. What's interesting is that even though they're old, the quality of the steel is actually way better than today. The J40 casing is a really, really nice steel. We made steel a bit better than in the past. And by the way, the metallurgy of these wells, we use what's called chromium steel to prevent corrosion. EPA has put out new guidelines for all of those well construction things. So the chromium steel is, you're just adding chrome to the steel to prevent corrosion. So some of those casings would include that kind of steel, much more expensive, but that's how it goes. Is this what the casing is going to look like on your property? I don't know. But again, you can run a tool down the well and interrogate the casing, just the metal piece and the cement. So you can look at what's called a cement bond log, or you can look at a casing integrity log. Every CO2 injection well, as well as every injection well, it has to go through what's called a mechanical integrity test, an MIT. And that means collecting data in the wellbore to know what the cement and the steel character is in that well. By the way, we're not talking about injecting CO2 in these old wells. These old wells are passive. They're sitting there waiting, and CO2 and the pressure is going to start interacting with those wells at some point. So anyway, that's materials. Here's just, this is pretty interesting. We got a chance to actually open a CO2 injection well, just open the wellhead, let it free flow at the surface to show what that would look like. That's essentially what it looks like. At near max flow rate, these rates were only about 100,000 tons a year, so a tenth of what a 1,000,000-ton-a-year well would be. So you could imagine that being up to 10 times bigger perhaps, but it still probably wouldn't even reach over to those trees. But in this case, you can see we're standing only a matter of 100 or 200 feet away. In this scenario, we were able to stand there and watch this. So the risks of a CO2 well blowout are possible, but the actual impacts are relatively minor in my experience. I've stood there. I got a couple other photos to show you that. Here's a case where the CO2 is now just kind of moving out over the ground. And this is the thing that becomes a point of concern for folks is that CO2 is more dense than the air, so it tends to kind of stay low. So it does disperse over the ground, and it can disperse over areas that might include part of a field or something like that. But it disperses very quickly. And the important thing to remember is CO2 is a natural thing in the environment and the air, and so it's not like an oil spill or something where the oil is not really a natural part of the environment. This is basically going to get assimilated into the atmosphere where it's a natural constituent anyway. So that's kind of what happens. I think I had one more of those, and then a pipeline one. Yeah, so this is just another example of letting a well flow at surface just to see kind of what that looks like. A lot of times it'll form dry ice. It'll depressurize any moisture that's around, it'll form dry ice. You'll see dry ice on the ground, and it'll end up evaporating pretty quickly. Pipeline aspects are probably a little bit more impactful. This is a case in Sartatia, Mississippi, and if you Google it, you're going to find reports of people turning into zombies, but that's just the way the world works today, unfortunately. This was a case where there was a heavy rainstorm and the ground slumped. There was a little mini landslide and the pipeline ruptured. And so all that white stuff you see is dry ice. It's solid CO2 with water. And in this case, the pipeline flowed for, I think, a couple days. They did evacuate a town. There were some hospitalizations, but I don't think there were any major health issues that came up here. I would say that basically the federal government has now released a new set of standards for pipelines in terms of how they're constructed, how they're monitored. They now include what are called you have to put in safety valves at every specific distance along the pipeline. One of the reasons this pipeline flowed for 2 days is there were no safety valves. If there are safety valves, you cut off the safety valves and it only evacuates the part of the pipeline between the safety valves. I've been to one of the pump stations for the Green Line here in Southeast Texas, and that's the case. They have valves on. And they also have what are called crack arresters now. So you put bands around the pipeline so that cracks can't propagate down the pipeline very far. So new rules and regs on this because we know we're going to be building more of them. So more scrutiny. Okay, before I get into the permitting, maybe just pause a little bit and ask if there's questions about this piece. Well construction, subsurface, engineering, geology, evaluation. You can go and see all this through the EPA website. You can see how many are being proposed and what their permit rates are, et cetera. But they are growing, and that's what you need to know is that, there are more and more applications. I know one company that has at least 7 in Jefferson County. I think there's probably others that have quite a few as well. So we were talking a little bit about scale. This scale is not correct, but it should hopefully give you a little bit of a sense. When EPA thinks about this, the subsurface, this is all schematic. It's not based on any specific location, but it gives you kind of a sense of the deep subsurface. And then you'll see some area of review and the number of wells that are inside that area of review. Some of those are injection wells that are new. Some of those are legacy wells that are old. And we could go into this, but the links are going to be in your version of this, and you can go and see more information on this. There's a page like this for almost every aspect of these wells. So this just happens to show sort of groundwater monitoring and what's suggested for permit applicants. And so again, you won't be able to read that, but it's like frequencies, it's what constituents you're measuring for, lots and lots of stuff. I mean, the amount of information that goes into this and the amount of monitoring that goes into this is actually quite extensive. Again, See over that. So that's good to know. It's not like we're giving primacy because, quote, it will be easier. It's as stringent. Okay. This is the example for size, and again, you'll have this to look at. But like, you could imagine tracts of land in there, right? Like in the lower right, you see some yellowish stuff. Those are like typical, sort of, I don't know, 100-acre, 200-acre tracts. And so you can't see it especially well, but the yellow shows up well. That's the area of review for that project. 3 wells, 1 million tons a year well. And then the purple is actually the area that would be put into monitoring, which would extend beyond sort of the CO2 itself. So again, you can imagine this covering, it could eventually be maybe the size of it was a really large project in this subsurface. People have a lot of questions about legacy wells on their property. And I've heard people that eventually find me and they say, why isn't the state dealing with my legacy well on my property? And I had to research this because at first I didn't have a good answer. But essentially, every state has a list of criteria that they score. And if the well score is really high, they put it at the top of the list for potential reviewers. If the well score is really low, even though it might not be completely, something to ignore, it's going to be lower on the list. So chances are a lot of people's wells are scoring low if they have concerns about it. Why? Because there's wells in like suburban communities in Harris County that have the potential to affect an entire subdivision. And that's one of the criteria is potential impact, health and safety impacts. So that well's going to go to the top of the list. So your well, which may just be idle and not doing anything, is actually going to score really low on your list. So that's why it tends to be a little difficult to. You'll hear maybe about, subsurface pressure, elevation in West Texas, and water being pushed to the surface, and sometimes those wells have gone on for quite a while. The reason they still rank low is not because what's happening isn't concerning, it's because its potential impact on people is quite low. And that's one of the most important criteria. I guess the underlying statement I can make here is if you would like to encourage the state to add criteria on this, that's a process you can go through. You can say, hey, we're experiencing new federal injection in house. We would like to have some element about that put into this criteria, so that maybe my well can be on the list. So I'm always going to tell you there's actually, for every concern you have, there is usually a pathway, almost always a pathway to affect it. It's not like how much energy or time effort is it put to go in that respect. But ultimately, the legislatures are responding to your requests. So if you call them up and tell them this is what you're interested in, it tells them, I need to figure out this. So that's one key message to you. So on the Railroad Commission website, you can go to that link. It's a GIS viewer. You can zoom in on an area. That's Winnie over there on the left where the highways diverge. And you can see where all the wells on the Railroad Commission database exist. You can click on those wells and you can learn them. You can zoom in and have a look. Not all of them, but some of them have quite a bit of information. Like here, you click on it, and it has well logs on the left. I had a hard time reading that. Drilling permits, disposal permits, you can learn about details is my point. Without doing a whole lot of effort. I do this all the time. Pull up a table and you can download PDFs of records. You can even get well logs. Look at well logs for wells. If they have that information, it's on your property, you can find that. Okay, some more landowner aspects. So I run into people and they say, "Oh, is this like farming practices? Carbon farming practices?" No. You can have an entirely different agreement with somebody to do modified agricultural practices on your land or forestry practices and have some other carbon deal on that. And people do. But this is not that. This is the subsurface. So not all people coming to talk to you might be talking about the same things. Probably find out what they're really talking about from the beginning. I suspect most of them are probably talking about subsurface review. The subsurface or the surface owner is the owner of the pore space in the subsurface, the warehouse, the room. The mineral owner is the owner of the stuff in that pore space. Oil and gas, mostly. Huge difference. The surface owner owns the warehouse, the mineral owner owns what's in the warehouse. Because in saline storage, you're injecting into formations of brine water and displacing the brine water and using the pore space, you are now using the warehouse. The trucks are coming to your warehouse. So the service owner is the pore space owner, is the owner contract. So in here in detail, you can see the Texas Supreme Court hearing that establishes this. I've been told in the legal community that it's fairly robust case law. That is, they don't think it's going to be reversed. And in fact, every state court based on this, the surface owner. Now, the mineral owner owns minerals in the pore space. And if you have long family history in the region, in some cases you can settle those estates. Now, land service owner is not the port, or not the mineral owner. So you could, in a settled estate, you could be developing a CO2 project with the surface owner and a mineral project with the mineral. If you own both, it's even better because you control it. But as you know, if you sold the mineral rights, someone can come in and develop the minerals without a whole lot of discussion. So, in some cases, like in Louisiana, they've said that a mineral developer has the right to continue to develop new or existing and new minerals on the lease through the mineral estate, totally separate from the CO2 activity. In Louisiana, you can even drill through the carbon storage project to get the deeper minerals, if that is the case. Be aware of that. I already talked about pressure and CO2 extent. One thing I need to mention is that Class 6 permitting is usually preceded by what's called a Class 6 well, or Class 5 well permit. Sorry to give you all these names, but a Class 5 permit is basically like an exploration permit. It's a characterization well. They're going to drill the well, they're going to log it, they're going to sample it. They're going to get all the information they need to potentially convert it into a Class 6 well. Right? So a Class 5 well is relatively easy to get. And you can find somebody that's filing for a Class 5 well and you properly review the characterization to allow them to apply for a Class 6 well. To read the information. When I was out at the EPA hearing for some of the wells in the public hearing in West Texas, the landowners were saying, well, this is fait accompli. This is, the rigs have already come and gone. And what they didn't understand is that the Class 5 wells can be coming into the Railroad Commission entirely separately from the Class 6 process. Those rigs can show up, drill a well, leave, and that doesn't mean that they're going to get the Class 6 permit. That just means they collected the information that allows them to apply for the Class 6 if they want. So Class 5 does not imply you get the Class 6. It implies you collected the data to allow you to apply for the Class 6. But it means there's a rig in effect. Okay, I already talked about most of the rest of those things. What could this look like? If you don't have experience with oil and gas on your property, this may be new to you, But if you drive around, you'll see this stuff. This is what a rig drilling to 10,000 feet looks like. Basically, they build a little platform, and they bring in trucks with pipe, and they start drilling, and they do all that. But that's essentially what it looks like. In this case, they didn't even actually put a fence between the drilling operation and the livestock, which I found it is. I know it's throughout the barbed wire fence, but possible. But literally, I mean, I was there, and I was wanted basically on the drill back, or whatever. So it's invasive, it's a big rig on your property, but it takes about a month to drill that well and log it and do all the things you need to do. And then all that goes away. So you might put in a new road, right? A new port road. I've talked to landowners that were like, oh, well, they put some aggregate down in the road? Because I think I want that in your bed. Or they might say, actually, I want you to completely convert it back to the pasture when you're gone. So that's in your lease. You get to decide what happens on all of this. This is back in my younger days. But in the monitoring front, this is kind of what monitoring can look like. So there's an observational wellhead right there. That wellhead is taking subsurface pressure measurements every few minutes in that data stream you see at the top. And that thing on the left is just a telemetry site. So that data is being sent out via, basically by phone to a satellite, and then it's being stored. And so they just put a little triangle of cattle guard around it, and that's what it looks like. So, that could be the footprint of the injection well too, by the way. The injection well looks just like the observation well. It's just the wellhead above surface, protected a little bit, so the cows don't go right up against it, change the flow rate, stuff like that. And then if you have a monitoring station, you might have an additional telemetry. For many of the projects in this part of the state, they will have these for seismometers to feel any potential seismicity. The seismometers are often buried. They're barely visible at the surface. And so that's an even much smaller kind of footprint that you might expect there. But so that's what it can kind of look like. Periodically the operator may need to come in and log the well. So they'll shut it in and they'll run a wireline tool down it. So they'll bring a crane truck or a logging truck over there on the right, and they'll run the tool into the well, and it could take a couple days. Maybe they might be out there as much as a week if they're doing something kind of involved. But it's a temporary thing, and they drive away at the end, and they're gone. So that's how they kind of go down and find out what's, take some measurements, saturation profile or something in the interval to make sure, again, that data is going into that reservoir model and simulation to confirm that what's happening down there is what we expected. So some permits may require periodic logging as well. I don't get into quite that level of detail. And so that's just some of the logging tools laid down next to the wellhead. In this case, the well pad is much bigger than what you might experience. A well pad could be the size of this room. Like this room would have together for census scale. And the wellhead would be like this. And so after you're gone, or whatever, and it becomes a relatively small situation. Okay, this is getting into good stuff that you can refer to later. These are all the statutes for Texas and Louisiana that relate to all these kinds of things, right? So this is there for you to go and look at. The far right column that you can't read is actually the statute that it relates to, that you can refer to when you talk to legislators or you can research and talk about. You want to understand what the rules are on all this. On terms of long-term liability, different states are taking very different approaches to this. Some states, I guess, what is it down there? West Virginia and Louisiana have said, 10 years after you stop injecting, you can apply to transfer it over to state ownership. So that means they're still monitoring for 10 years after they stop injecting. Maybe they're coming into a quarterly bottom of pressure measurement, Maybe they still have those seismometers out there. So if they inject for 20 years and their post-injection monitoring is 10 years, 30 years, and it might be a kid's land by that point. In Texas, the long-term liability is only assumed by projects on state land. And really, this is mostly offshore land. So right now, and I've been with the Texas legislature in the last session, been in those committee hearings, and I actually heard them say that right now the state is not going to take liability for projects on private land. That's up for discussion, and we can impact that in the current legislative session that started this week. I'll show you how. But that's the code that relates to that. Okay, I think I got most of this in there. It's a process. It's not like you turn the wells off and walk away and you're done. There's a whole long process you have to go through to close the site and abandon the site. So there's all that there. Last session there was a big topic on integration, which is another way of saying unitization. So that would be if a certain number of landowners wants to participate in the project, does that require that the adjacent landowners get involved in the project? The legislature said, we're not talking about that. They basically said, we've seen very large land leases in Texas already that didn't require this, so we're not going to legislate on it. Right? But the entities that testified in the session I was in were basically like, it's 100% or nothing. Everybody's part of it or not. One important point is that in every state, if you are integrated or unitized, you get the same benefits as the group that originally participated. So they cannot deny you the rights you should receive for being integrated. So if you do get integrated at some point, it's not like you can't receive benefit. In gas, oil and gas, we have cooling regulations, where you can cool a surface reservoir. And I include lots of landowners, and in that case, you can't pull in everything in both cooling agreements. But you get a royalty, the same royalty that the others got, actually. Okay. Oh, if you want to get really into this, call up Drew Darby. He's the rep from San Angelo, but he's the one on the House Committee on Energy Resources in Texas, and he's the one that was chairing those meetings, those legislative hearings I went through back in the last session. Nice guy, really interested in the topic, wants to hear from you. He's dealing with this in his own district, so he's highly engaged, and you can talk to him. He's a great guy. Okay, again, this is for your later perusal as you like, but the Great Plains Institute has a legislative tracker. You can go and see what legislation is being proposed or is already in place in any given region. So pretty great. You can't read it, but over on the left is Class 6 primacy, Class 2, pore space ownership, pore space utilization, blah, blah, blah. There is a place in here on subsurface trespass. That's a whole topic we could get into as to what that could potentially mean. But this is there for you. Louisiana has progressed far, far further than Texas on these issues. And they have passed unitization, they've passed eminent domain for pipeline. They've moved a lot more aggressively. So what's happening in Cameron Parish, right next door to you, is worlds different right now than what's happening here in Jefferson County. That's a fast-forward version of what you might expect to see here with the legislature continuing to put legislation in place. So I bring it up here because you'll see what your neighbors are doing across the river. Eminent domain provisions. Louisiana basically said, yeah, that pipeline can go there, and you don't have to be a common carrier, if you know what that means. But in Texas, when they built what's called the Green Pipeline through this part of the state, there was only one section that had eminent domain and was required to be a common carrier, which means I had to carry CO2 for everybody, but only on that section, so whatever. But anyway, in Texas right now, CO2 pipelines are not under eminent domain. there are lots of rules and regs on building CO2 pipelines. We've already built them as part of the state. It's pretty straightforward right now, and the new rules and regs do it. We talked about minimization. So here's a bunch of resources for you. You can go and you can go to our center, and there's lots of information. You can get in touch with me if I don't have the right information. I can get you someone who does. The DOE has their annual newsletter, monthly newsletter, which actually covers the entire United States. So it might be more than not in your inbox, but that's where they talk about a lot of what's happening around the United States. There's a global CCS Institute. They have a lot of information, frequently asked questions, so it's the Carbon Center, et cetera, et cetera. There's the EPA Class 6 program, the Railroad Commission map that I showed you, the Great Plains Tracker, and what's called the CDRlaw.org. They have a lot of information on legal aspects of CCS, so you can peruse through that as well. I guess what I'll leave you with, I think was one of software, should ask the Q&A. What I'll leave you with is, it's a big opportunity for landowners. As long as they understand what it involves, they can make a decision as to whether it makes sense for them or not to throw into a project, right? They get a short-term lease that allows for development. That's going to have a bonus payment for you. Then if they go into a long-term lease, there's going to be a potential royalty structure for every ton of CO2 ejected, just like for every MCF of gas removed. There will be a lease payment. So recurring things. I've talked to landowners in other parts of the state that have done a lot of wind development, and they're like, awesome, this is another revenue source for my property. And as long as what you're doing is consistent with my agricultural practices and my wind farm, I'm interested, right? So everybody responds to it differently. I talked to the Texas Farm Bureau, I talked to the Texas Landowners Association. There are just some people who are like, this isn't for me, and that's fine. There are others who are like, I'm curious, but need to know more. And then there are some who are like, I have 3 generations of oil and gas experience, everything you're describing to me, I understand and I feel comfortable with. So, big opportunity. Keep in mind that it comes with a need to understand this stuff. There are ways to understand that, how much time you want to invest in that is up to you. But there are lots of resources that can help you with this. So, I think that's what I have for you. If hopefully that was helpful. If you have lots of questions, let's go around and we can talk about those.